My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 27 years old, and until last Thanksgiving, I thought being useful was the same thing as being loved. I worked long shifts as a flight operations coordinator outside Pittsburgh, the kind of job where one mistake could delay an entire crew, and somehow that still felt easier than walking into my own family's dining room. By the time I pulled into the driveway that night, I was already tired in the way that sits behind your eyes. The house smelled like turkey, butter, sage, and the kind of forced peace families put on like a tablecloth when everyone knows something ugly is hiding underneath. I had brought 2 pies, a bottle of wine I couldn't really afford, and the same stupid hope I brought every year, that maybe this time nobody would turn dinner into a courtroom with me as the defendant. I was wrong. The first half hour was all smiles, all harmless little questions, all that polished family performance people put on before they decide who gets humiliated first. Then my mother set down her glass, looked straight at me, and said it in front of everyone like she'd been rehearsing it for weeks. "You are a burden, Claire, and after tonight, you can't live with us anymore." Nobody laughed, but nobody defended me either. My father looked down. My younger sister froze with her fork halfway to her mouth, and in that 1 second something inside me stopped begging to belong there. Because the truth was worse than being unwanted. The truth was that I had been paying to stay in a home where they had already decided I was expendable. What happened next didn't explode all at once. It unraveled slowly, brutally, and in a way none of them saw coming. Before I tell you what happened after I stood up from that table, and what I said the next morning while packing my bags, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. Thanksgiving had always been presented as sacred in our house, which really meant nobody was allowed to say anything honest until the damage was impossible to hide. That year, the table looked perfect in the way fragile things often do right before they crack. Golden turkey in the center, a dish of sweet potatoes dusted with cinnamon, green beans no one ever really liked, my mother's linen napkins folded like we were performing for some invisible audience, and candles she only lit when she wanted the evening to look more successful than it felt. I had barely taken my seat before the usual routine began. My father asked how work was going in that distracted tone people use when they want credit for caring without risking a real conversation. My sister asked whether I would be on call over Christmas, and I told her maybe, because the winter schedule was always unpredictable. My mother smiled too brightly and started talking about rising prices, the cost of groceries, the mortgage, how difficult it was to run a household when some people understood responsibility and other people only knew how to drift. She didn't say my name at first. She never did when she wanted maximum effect. She liked warming the room first, letting discomfort spread slowly until everybody knew exactly where she was aiming, but nobody was brave enough to interrupt. I recognized that rhythm because I had funded it for months. For almost a year, I had been covering the electric bill from my checking account, paying for the internet, sending money toward mortgage shortages whenever my father said things were tight again, and quietly helping with Macy's school expenses whenever my mother used that wounded, exhausted tone that made refusal sound cruel. They called it helping the family. They called it doing the right thing. But somehow those phrases always meant my money and never my opinion. I remember looking around that table and realizing everyone there knew pieces of the truth, but not one of them was willing to assemble the whole thing. Then my mother finally did what she had clearly been waiting all evening to do. She set her fork down, dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin, looked directly at me, and said, "I'm going to say what everyone here is thinking. Claire, you're a burden. You're too old to still be here, and after tonight, you need to figure something else out." The room went so still I could hear the dishwasher humming in the kitchen and the faint rattle of the vent above the stove. For one strange second, I thought I had misheard her, because cruelty is always more surreal when it arrives in a calm voice. I actually laughed once, not because it was funny, but because shock sometimes sounds like disbelief trying to protect itself. A burden? I asked. That's the word you picked? My mother crossed her arms and leaned back slightly like she was settling into a decision she had already rehearsed in private. Yes, she said. You come and go, take up space, bring your moods into this house, and act like the world owes you patience. I stared at her, almost admiring the precision of it. She had managed to erase every bill I paid, every crisis I covered, every practical thing I had done to keep that house steady, and reduce me to an inconvenience with a suitcase. I turned toward my father, expecting at least discomfort, some human flicker that would tell me this had gone too far. But he only stared at his plate and rubbed his thumb along the edge of his water glass. That silence told me more than any speech could have. Macy whispered, "Mom." But so softly, it barely counted as resistance. My mother didn't even look at her. She kept her eyes on me, confident now, because she could feel the room staying with her through inaction. That was the worst part. Not just the insult, but the certainty behind it. She said it like she knew nobody there would challenge her version of me. I stood up slowly, pushed my chair back, and asked the only question that mattered. "Do you really want me gone?" She held my gaze without flinching. Yes. Clean, flat, public, final. Something cold moved through me then, colder than rage and steadier than pain. I picked up my coat, left the pie I had brought untouched on the counter, and walked toward the door. Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed me into the driveway. Nobody called my name. And standing there under the porch light with November air cutting through my sweater and my hands shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice, I finally understood the real humiliation of that dinner. It wasn't that my mother had called me a burden. It was that I had spent so long trying to be useful to people who had already decided usefulness was the only reason to keep me. That was the moment I made my decision. If they wanted to know what life looked like without me in that house, they were about to learn every single part of it. I barely slept that night. After leaving the house, I drove without thinking for nearly 40 minutes before parking outside a 24-hour pharmacy with the engine still running and the heater on low. The fluorescent sign buzzed above me. Cars came and went, and I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, replaying my mother's voice until the words stopped sounding like a sentence and started sounding like a verdict. Burden. She had chosen that word carefully. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't heat-of-the-moment anger. It was the kind of word people use when they want to make your existence feel expensive. I should have cried harder than I did. I should have collapsed under it. Instead, sometime around 3 a.m, hurt began hardening into something more useful. There is a kind of anger that wrecks you, and there is a kind that finally introduces you to yourself. By dawn, I had both. When I walked back into the house the next morning, nobody acted like a line had been crossed. That alone almost stunned me more than the dinner itself. My father was at the kitchen table pretending to read the news on his tablet, refreshing the same screen over and over like concentration could excuse cowardice. My mother stood by the coffee maker wearing her robe, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who believed she had said something unpleasant but necessary. Macy hovered by the fridge, quiet and pale, clearly aware that the house had shifted overnight even if she didn't know how to fix it. I said nothing. I went straight upstairs, opened my closet, pulled down my suitcase, and started packing. Not dramatically, not while sobbing, not in a panic. I folded clothes with the mechanical focus people use when emotion would only slow them down. Sweaters first, then work pants, then my toiletries, my chargers, my flight manuals, my laptop, and the framed college photo I had once kept downstairs until my mother said it made the living room look cluttered. I had just zipped one side of the suitcase when she appeared in the doorway and leaned against the frame like I was inconveniencing her morning. "So you're really going to make a scene out of this?" she asked. That sentence told me everything. In her version of reality, she had not made a scene by humiliating her daughter in front of the family at Thanksgiving dinner. I was making a scene by taking her seriously. I didn't answer right away. I kept packing for a few more seconds, then said, "You told me to leave?" She shrugged, almost bored. "I told you the truth. That's different." A few seconds later, my father appeared behind her, but he stayed several feet back, as if physical distance might protect him from moral responsibility. "Claire," he said, "maybe just calm down and think this through before you do something dramatic." I turned and looked at both of them, really looked, and for the first time the entire structure of our family felt obvious. My mother handled the cruelty. My father handled the silence that made it survivable for her. Everyone else adjusted around the damage and called it normal. "I already thought it through," I said. "Probably a lot longer than either of you have." My mother folded her arms. "Then let me save you the disappointment. Living on your own isn't as easy as pretending you're some underappreciated martyr in this house." The contempt in that sentence almost made me laugh, because it was still built on the same assumption: that I was bluffing, that fear would send me back into line, that I would rather accept humiliation than uncertainty. She still didn't understand that uncertainty was beginning to look peaceful compared to staying. I carried a box into the hallway. She followed me downstairs, talking the whole way in that clipped tone she used when she wanted every word to feel like a correction. "You have no idea what the real world costs. You think paying a few things here and there makes you the backbone of this house? You are unbelievably arrogant sometimes." I stopped halfway down the stairs and turned around slowly. "A few things here and there?" I repeated. But I let it go for the moment and kept walking, because I wasn't ready to say everything yet. In the living room, with my suitcase by the door and my keys in my hand, she looked at me with that tight, victorious smile she always wore when she thought life was about to teach me a lesson on her behalf. "You'll be back in a month," she said. "Maybe less." And that was when something in me settled. Not cracked. Settled. All the panic of the night before burned off, and what remained was clarity. I looked at her, then at my father, then at the room I had spent years helping maintain, without ever truly belonging to it. And I said the 4 words that changed everything: "Cover your own bills." For a moment nobody reacted, as if the sentence had entered the room in a language they didn't recognize. Then my mother blinked. My father looked up sharply. Macy froze near the hallway. I let the silence sit there long enough to become understanding before I added, "Starting today." That was the first time I saw actual fear move across my father's face. My mother opened her mouth, but nothing came out immediately, and that alone told me I had finally said the one thing they had never prepared for. They had prepared for tears. They had prepared for pleading. They had prepared for guilt, retreat, and reconciliation. They had not prepared for consequences. They had never thought of my help as dependence, because dependence sounds embarrassing when you say it out loud. They called it family. They called it pulling together. They called it doing my part. But standing there beside my suitcase, watching their expressions shift from insulted to confused to quietly alarmed, I knew they were finally doing the math, not just financially, but psychologically. If I walked out and really meant what I had just said, then the system they had been living on without naming it was about to collapse in plain sight. My mother recovered first. She always did. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, letting out a dry laugh that sounded more defensive than amused. "We are not dependent on you." I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and looked directly at her. The electric autopay comes from my account. The internet comes from my account. I've been transferring money to Dad for the mortgage every second Friday. I paid Macy's senior trip deposit, her laptop fee, and the HVAC repair in September. I also covered groceries twice last month when your card declined. Do you want me to keep going? My father stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor, the noise sharp enough to make Macy flinch. He hated facts whenever facts disrupted the comfort of pretending not to know things. That's not fair, he said immediately, which told me he had no argument stronger than denial. We never asked you to do all that. I stared at him. No, I said. You just accepted it every single time. My mother stepped forward then, anger returning because exposure always enraged her more than conflict itself. You're acting like we exploited you. That is disgusting. I almost admired how quickly she shifted into offense, how naturally she recast herself as the wounded party. No, I said calmly. I'm acting like I'm done being used and insulted in the same household. Macy looked between us, confused and pale. Wait, she said softly. You paid for my trip? I turned toward her and nodded once. Yeah, Mom said the deadline moved up and things were tight. Macy's eyes widened, then moved slowly to our mother. You told me Dad picked up extra jobs. My father's face hardened, embarrassed now in a way he hadn't been at dinner. My mother snapped before he could answer. This is not the issue right now. But it was the issue. It was every issue. The unpaid emotional debt, the financial dependence, the selective truth. The family mythology built on making one person responsible and then resenting her for being necessary. I picked up my keys and moved toward the door, but my mother stepped in front of me. You are not going to threaten this household because you got your feelings hurt, she said. That sentence followed me for weeks because it was so revealing. To her, the problem was never the humiliation, never the lie, never the fact that she had reduced her daughter to a burden after benefiting from her income. The problem was that I was refusing to absorb it gracefully and stay useful anyway. I'm not threatening anyone, I said. I'm leaving exactly the way you asked. My father tried again, softer this time, as if changing tone could erase contempt. Claire, be practical. Where are you even going to go? I looked at him and realized he still believed uncertainty was more frightening than disrespect. Somewhere I'm not paying to be unwanted, I said. That landed harder than I expected. Even my mother looked away for half a second. I drove to work with my suitcase in the trunk, a duffel bag in the back seat, and the kind of hollow adrenaline that makes ordinary traffic lights feel surreal. At the operations office, everything looked offensively normal. Flight boards updated. Phones rang. People complained about weather delays and crew timing. I answered emails, checked manifests, confirmed turnaround times, and spent the entire morning functioning with the eerie clarity that sometimes follows a personal disaster. During lunch, I called my best friend, Nina Brooks, who lived 20 minutes away in Dormont and had spent the last year telling me my family didn't treat me like a daughter, they treated me like emergency infrastructure. She picked up on the first ring. Hey, are you okay? I started with, no, and then told her everything. Not the polished version, not the version that made everyone sound complicated and sympathetic. The exact version. The dinner, the word burden, the doorway, the 4 words, the silence afterward. I could hear Nina's breathing change as I spoke, the way it does when someone who loves you is trying not to interrupt with anger. When I finally stopped, she said, very quietly, Claire, come stay with me tonight. Then, after a pause, she added, and do not send them another dollar out of guilt. Not one. I turned in my chair and looked through the office window at a regional jet taxiing across the tarmac, guided by lights, lines, signals, systems, all of it designed to keep something heavy from going off course. That image stayed with me. I had spent years being that system for my family, silently correcting, covering, adjusting, stabilizing. And now they were furious that I had stepped off the runway. That evening, when I drove to Nina's apartment instead of my parents' house, I expected panic to hit the second I parked. Instead, I felt exhausted, humiliated, hungry, relieved, and strangely calm all at once. Nina met me at the curb in socks and a sweatshirt, took one look at my face, grabbed the duffel from my back seat, and said, "You're not going back there tonight." It was such a simple sentence, but I nearly cried hearing it, because it was the first thing anyone had said in 2 days that sounded like protection instead of control. Inside her apartment, with a lamp glowing in the corner and takeout containers on the coffee table, the world felt smaller, safer, and more honest than the house I had just left. And for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, I let myself consider the possibility that walking away had not destroyed my life. It may have been the first step toward getting it back. The first 48 hours after I left were almost funny in a dark, revealing kind of way. My mother didn't call to apologize. She called to test my boundary. The first message said, "You forgot your winter coat." The second said, "The utility company emailed something weird." The third said, "Your father can't access the payment portal." By message 4, the performance had cracked. "Claire, this is childish." By message 6, the anger had arrived in full. "You do not get to punish this family because you're oversensitive." I ignored them all until that night, when my father finally called. Not to ask how I was, not to ask where I was staying. He asked whether the electric bill had really been set to my account and whether I had paused anything. That word did something to me. Paused. As if I had temporarily interrupted a service they assumed would resume once I cooled off. "No," I said. "I canceled everything in my name." Silence. Then he exhaled hard and muttered, "Jesus, Claire." I almost said, "You should have said that at the dinner table." Instead, I hung up. At Nina's apartment, I slept on a pull-out couch beside a bookshelf and a floor lamp with a crooked shade, and it felt more restful than any night I'd spent in that house in years. On my third day there, I found a studio in Mount Lebanon above a family-owned pharmacy. It had slanted ceilings, old hardwood floors, a radiator that clanged when it woke up, and exactly one tiny window over the sink. It was perfect, because it was mine. I signed the lease during my lunch break. That evening, I went back to my parents' house for the rest of my things, and the place already felt different. Not sad. Unstable. My mother opened the door with the expression of someone who had expected time to weaken me. My father stood in the hallway pretending to replace a smoke detector battery he had probably been holding for 20 minutes. Macy came down the stairs the second she heard my voice. "Claire, wait," she said, following me to my room. Once the door was half closed, she whispered, "Did you really pay for my school stuff and the trip and my laptop deposit?" I nodded. "Yeah." Her face went pale. "Mom told me Dad picked up extra construction shifts." I let out a breath through my nose. "Dad hasn't picked up extra shifts in almost a year." She sat down on the edge of my bed like the floor had moved under her. Why would she lie? That question is heartbreaking when it comes from someone young enough to still think lies have to be logical. "Because if you knew," I said, folding my uniforms into a box, "you might start asking who the burden really was." Downstairs, the argument started before I even reached the front hall. My mother accused me of turning Macy against her. My father accused me of overreacting and destabilizing the house. I looked around at the unpaid notices on the counter, the half-filled grocery bags, the tension vibrating under every sentence, and finally understood something liberating. I had not broken that household by leaving. I had simply stopped holding the broken pieces together. My mother stepped closer and lowered her voice, that dangerous calm she used when she wanted words to land harder. If you walk out again like this, don't expect us to be here when your little independent fantasy falls apart. I picked up my last box, opened the front door, and said, "Then we're clear." I didn't slam the door. I didn't need to. The truth I left behind was louder than any exit. Moving into that studio changed my body before it changed my mind. I started sleeping through the night. My shoulders dropped. I stopped bracing when my phone lit up. I bought 2 plates, 1 skillet, a secondhand coffee maker, and a blue bath towel that didn't match anything, and every small thing felt like proof that peace could be built from scratch. But freedom is not as simple as walking out one door and locking another behind you. Some nights I still sat on the floor with takeout in my lap and wondered whether I had done something unforgivable. Years of family conditioning do not disappear just because the rent is in your name now. My mother made sure of that. She shifted tactics after anger stopped working. She started sending paragraphs about sacrifice, about how mothers aren't perfect, about how hard adulthood really is, about how disappointing it was that I had chosen money over family. Then came the extended family. An aunt texted that my parents were under terrible strain. A cousin I barely spoke to messaged me, "I heard you abandoned your family right before Christmas." That one stunned me enough to laugh. There it was. The revised story, already making the rounds. I was no longer the daughter who had been called a burden and kicked out after years of financial support. I was the selfish daughter who left her struggling parents when they needed her most. Nina told me not to respond to any of it, but I needed air. So one Sunday afternoon, I drove to a small park in Bethel Park, where my grandfather, Walter Bennett, often sat feeding birds and pretending he didn't enjoy correcting strangers about baseball statistics. He saw me before I reached the bench and gave me that long, quiet look older men have when they suspect the truth is uglier than the version everyone else is selling. "You look tired, kiddo," he said. I sat beside him and told him everything. This time I didn't edit my story to sound fair. I told him about the mortgage transfers, the utilities, Macy's expenses, the Thanksgiving ambush, the burden line, the calls afterward, and the lies now spreading through the family. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he shook his head slowly and said, "Your mother always wanted control more than closeness. I hoped age would soften that. Looks like it sharpened it." Hearing someone older say it out loud nearly broke me. Not because it was new, but because it was accurate. "Did I do the wrong thing?" I asked. He looked straight ahead at the pond and said, "No, you did the expensive thing. People confuse those two all the time." I laughed through tears at that. Then he added, "The hardest lesson in adulthood is that some people only love you comfortably when you are useful. The minute you stop being useful, they call you difficult, or selfish, or ungrateful. In your case, burden." I swallowed hard. What do I do now? He turned to me then. "You build a life they can't rewrite." That sentence stayed with me the whole drive home. Build a life they can't rewrite. Not defend myself endlessly. Not beg to be understood. Build. That night, I blocked 3 relatives, muted my mother, and started doing something I should have done a long time ago. I gathered everything. Screenshots of bank transfers, utility confirmations, school receipts, repair invoices, mortgage notes. Not because I wanted revenge in the theatrical sense, because I was done letting truth be optional. The end came 2 weeks before Christmas, and it came the way things usually come in families like mine, not with grace, but with pressure. My father called me from an unknown number because I had stopped picking up his regular one. His voice was tight, thinner than I remembered. "Claire, the mortgage is short. Your mother said maybe there was some misunderstanding about what you stopped covering." I stood in my kitchen holding a grocery bag and almost admired the phrasing. A misunderstanding. As if my departure had been an accounting error. There's no misunderstanding, I said. I stopped funding a house where I was called a burden. He sighed like I was making the conversation inconvenient. Can we not do this again? That was the moment something final clicked into place. You mean, can we not talk honestly again? I asked. He hung up. 20 minutes later, my mother called. This time I answered because I was done being chased by half-finished conversations. She didn't waste time. If this house goes under because of your tantrum, you'll have that on your conscience forever. I leaned against the counter and looked around my tiny studio, the radiator hissing, the dish towel hanging crookedly, the life I had built one calm purchase at a time. No, I said. What I'll have on my conscience is finally leaving a place that used shame as rent. She inhaled sharply. How dare you talk to me like that after everything I've done for you? There are sentences so practiced they reveal themselves before they persuade anyone. I almost answered the old way, with panic and explanation. Instead I said, very clearly, you called me a burden in front of the family. You told me to leave. I left. That's the story. She started to raise her voice, but I cut in first. And since everyone seems confused, I fixed that too. Earlier that afternoon, after one more relative hinted I should help your parents quietly instead of making them look bad, I had sent a simple, factual message into the family group chat. No insults, no drama, just dates, amounts, screenshots, and one paragraph. Since there seems to be confusion, I'd like to clarify that I paid the electric, internet, several mortgage shortfalls, Macy's school expenses, and multiple household repairs over the past year. On Thanksgiving, I was called a burden and told I could no longer live there. I moved out the next morning and ended all payments in my name. Please stop contacting me to suggest I abandoned a household I was financially supporting. That was it. Clean, documented, irrefutable. The silence after I sent it lasted 9 minutes. Then the calls began. An aunt apologized. A cousin unsent a lecture. My grandfather texted, proud of you. Macy called crying, not because I had exposed anyone, but because she had finally seen how much of her reality had been edited for her. My mother, of course, was furious. Not about what happened, about the loss of narrative control. You humiliated us, she said. No, I answered. I corrected you. She went very quiet after that, the kind of quiet that means rage has run into a wall it can't push through. Then she said the saddest, truest thing she had said in years. You've changed. I looked at the window above my sink, where the glass reflected a tired woman who finally resembled herself. Yes, I said. That was the point. We didn't speak again after that call. Not really. There were a few logistical messages through my father, a forwarded text document, one awkward text in January asking whether I wanted an old box of ornaments. But the emotional structure of our family was over. My mother could no longer threaten me with exile after I had survived it. My father could no longer hide in neutrality after everyone had seen what his silence cost. Macy started visiting me on Sundays. We made boxed pancakes, watched bad cable movies, and slowly learned how to talk without someone else rewriting the conversation. By spring, I got promoted at work. I bought a better couch. I stopped checking my phone with dread. And one night, while labeling leftovers in my own refrigerator after a 12-hour shift, I realized I had gone almost an entire day without hearing my mother's voice in my head. That was when I understood what my 4 words had really ended. Not just the payments, not just the arrangement. They ended the version of me that believed love had to be earned through exhaustion. Cover your own bills. That's what I said. 4 words. Petty maybe. Sharp, definitely. but they forced everyone in that house to face the truth they had been avoiding for years. My mother lost her backup plan. My father lost the luxury of pretending. And I lost something too, the illusion that family automatically means safety. But what I gained was worth more: peace, boundaries, self-respect, a life that finally belonged to me. So if you've ever been told you were too much, too expensive, too emotional, too difficult, or a burden by the very people who benefited from your loyalty, hear me clearly. Sometimes walking away is not cruelty. Sometimes it is the first honest thing you do. And sometimes the people who call you selfish are just angry that you stopped making their life easier at the cost of your own.